This video lecture is on Book 10, the final book of Plato's Republic. There are three main points that I'm going to focus on in this video that the book as well is largely about. The first concerns imitation. So what is imitation? Why imitation is problematic? The status of imitation in Callipolis and in the Republic as a whole. Secondly, the myth of Socrates spends a lot of time actually at the very end of the book explaining this myth that is meant to justify why there's a reason someone should aim at being just, having a just soul, and why it's not just in this life that we suffer instances of injustice, but in the afterlife as well. And then finally, I'll just end briefly considering how to interpret Callipolis, the ideal city, the beautiful city, the city in speech as a whole. Book 10 actually begins when Glaucon mentions the fact that, okay, Socrates, you've constructed the city in books 2 through 5, or really 4. We considered the first and second waves in book 5. Book 6 and 7 dealt with the third wave, so we're really kind of trying to understand and see what the limits are, or whether we can justify this ideal city. Then we have in books 8 and 9, we explain the degeneration of Callipolis, all the way from democracy to oligarchy, democracy, and then tyranny. But now, in book 10, after all that's discussed, what's the point? Okay, you've described what seems like, perhaps the ideal city, but that city hasn't, as far as we know, existed anywhere before. It doesn't exist now, and we've already mentioned the conditions of such a city don't exist, and why it even seems that it's unlikely, to exist at all. And Socrates responds to Glaucon saying, well, yes, the city doesn't exist, and maybe it's unlikely, yeah, but that doesn't mean that one can't try to become just. In fact, one who desires a just soul can imitate within their own soul the ideal pattern of the just soul. He says, but in heaven a pattern is laid up for the man who wants to see and found a city within himself on the basis of what he sees. It doesn't make any difference whether it is or will be somewhere, for he would mind the things of this city alone and of no other. So Socrates basically says, look, we can imitate the pattern of the ideal soul in oneself. I can make a city within myself, the just city within my own soul, become a just person. Glaucon responds to that by pointing out that in book 3, poetry was largely, as well as all other forms of imitation, banned. So how could it be the case that we, in book 3 discussed all the dangers of imitation, why imitation should be limited, if not most of the time outright banned in the ideal city because of its corrupting characteristics, and yet now, Socrates, you're speaking of, well, in order to become just, you have to engage in imitation. Something doesn't, quite seem right about that. So this leads Socrates to try to explain, first, what is the nature of imitation, and then explain why imitation is so problematic. And Socrates says that imitation is 3 steps from the forms. That if we think of, in the case of a bed, we have an idea. We have the idea of a bed, what its purpose is to serve, a place that you sleep on. Then we have, from the idea, the actual bed that you can actually use, that you can sleep on. But what is an imitation? An imitation is basically a copy of that thing. It is a representation of the real thing, and the real thing is a representation of the idea of that thing. Well, if the idea of the thing is in some way less perfect, if the real thing, like the actual bed you can use, that a carpenter might make, if that is less perfect than the ideal thing, Because, well, you can have many different kinds of beds that are all different from each other, so they're all in some way an instantiation of the idea of a bed. Well, then an imitation is just the imitation of, or the representation of that which is already an instantiation and is not fully the idea itself. So it is, in terms of its truth, third removed from that which is true. So we can see then imitation is by nature closer to ignorance than it is truth. Imitators, Socrates says, it appears as if they create things. When they, engage in a painting, we can think about a sculptor or a sculpture. We can think about, the arts, dancing. We can think about poetry, what rhetoricians engage in. But the fact is that, engaging in philosophy, we see beyond the appearance of the thing and see really it's only a copy of that which is more real. So art imitates the specifics, but it does not imitate the universal and the ideal. Art can try to imagine, right, through its imitation, the universal and the ideal, but it always does so by drawing from the physical world. It can never draw from the universal itself, because the universal is abstract. In that sense, it is quite literally, the forms are forms, but they're not the content of which we see in the physical world. So an artist who paints a bed only makes a copy of the idea of a bed. And this means the artist's knowledge is less than the person who uses the thing that is painted. So the person who actually uses a bed has more knowledge of a bed than someone who just paints the bed. In the same way that, we can think of someone who explores a mountain range, right, hikes through it. They have more knowledge of that mountain range than the person who merely paints the mountain range. Or the same way with the scientist who surveys the mountain range, or the geographer, right, has more knowledge than the one who imitates through art the mountain range. But the perhaps really interesting claim that Socrates makes is that the user of an object knows more than the maker. So, someone who uses a bed has more knowledge of a bed, or the idea of a bed, than the person who actually who constructs the bed. That the person who uses a car has more knowledge of the idea of a car than the individual who makes the car. Which is really interesting, because we could also think about this in terms of, the maker, in terms of, in the dialogue, they are the kind of creators of Callipolis in speech. So wouldn't that mean those who actually who act out the ideal city, in actual practice, have more knowledge of the ideal city, more knowledge of justice, than those who actually create, the city? We can think about what that might mean about the Republic and the kind of activity they've undergone in trying to construct in speech the just city. I mean, what do you think about that? Do you buy the reasoning? Because what Socrates says is that, look, someone, if you create an axe, okay, you can make the axe, but the person who uses the axe is going to, through their activity, understand every bit as to whether it succeeds in the idea or not. Because you can make the axe, and the idea of the axe is, it should cut wood successfully. But I'm going to use the axe. I'm going to test. Does this actually cut the wood excellently or not? Does it have problems? Is it too dull? Is the grip not sufficient? Is the weighting wrong in the axe, such that I can judge the axe to be, a really bad representation of the idea of the axe? Or perhaps I can judge that the idea is wrong because it doesn't do in practice what the idea says it ought to do. And there's a really kind of interesting implication, which is that, to what extent can we actually privilege a theory or the idea of something over praxis, engaging in activity, that thing? But more. Arts deal, or all those kinds of activities that imitate deal in the illusory. Art depends on illusion to achieve its desired end, which is a kind of belief, or persuasion, really is the better word, I think, persuasion. Art necessarily deals with the illusory because since it is third removed from the truth, it has to take, or it has to engage in appearances. And appearances are the best thing that manipulate people, that get people to engage in certain kinds of activities, which is why the arts are so dangerous, because they persuade individuals who don't know better. Because that which is illusory is that which is appearance only, well, illusion then is contradictory to the best human virtue, which is reason, because reason is interested in that which is more real. Reason is interested in being, in essence, in the nature of things, in the forms. But imitations, Socrates says, they only provoke irrational excitement, right? And this is the difference between depictions of the good that a certain poet might write about, or a certain artist might paint, and other kinds of imitations of the good through maybe using calculation can lead one to actually pursue the good, which was talked about in books 6 and 7. So if imitation, mimesis, necessarily is illusory, it deals in illusory things, and because it deals in illusory things, it's able to manipulate other individuals and get them to pursue things which appear to be good, but which aren't actually good. We can see why imitation is so dangerous for the ideal city, for a city that tries to be just. You have to safeguard education, because you don't want people to think that they're pursuing education when in fact they're pursuing something which is going to corrupt them, which is going to make them bad citizens. And so it was for this reason that poetry was banned from Callipolis in Book 3, because they tell immoral stories and falsehoods. After Socrates explains the nature of imitation, why imitation is so problematic, Glaucon is still wondering, well, why, though, should I really be just? It seems like it's only in this life that I should care about being just. And so we have a kind of return to the beginning again of that question, why should one be just? What are the rewards for being just? Linking all the way back to the beginning of Book 2 and ultimately Book 1. So we have the kind of mirroring, we've gone full circle now, of Book 1 and Book 10 kind of lining up. And Socrates is going to give an account of what is known as the myth of Before we see what the myth of is, I want to note a couple things. First, it was argued earlier that justice was a good in itself. That one should be just precisely for the reason that it is a good in itself. Glaucon, because of this kind of questioning, he seems to have not fully grasped onto why one ought to be good. So we might want to think of the myth of that Socrates is about to tell as, an attempt, the last attempt Socrates can make to give Glaucon something to grab onto, which can bring him closer to being just, to pursuing truth, and thinking philosophically. Perhaps the myth of is that last-ditch thing one can offer someone who's not thinking philosophically, and kind of like, as a noble lie, get them to start acting out in just ways, even if they don't fully understand it. The second point is that the myth of is an imitation. Myths are imitations. They're stories. Well, if the myth of just like other myths told in the Republic and other Platonic dialogues we can think about as well, if the myth of is an imitation, what relation does it have to what had just been discussed about imitation? Should we be suspicious of the myth of or, even though if imitation is third removed from the truth, does it play a necessary role in philosophy, in pursuing the truth? Before Socrates explains the myth of and for the myth of to try to make sense to Glaucon, Adeimantus, and the others, the whole story depends on this idea that the soul is immortal. It lasts forever. And Socrates gives a very quick argument. And it basically has two premises and a conclusion. The first premise is that for each thing there is a unique good and a unique bad. And he says that what destroys and corrupts everything is the bad, and what saves and benefits is the good. Because, well, the good is being itself, as we discussed in books 6 and 7. So the bad is literally the absence of good. And so bad would then necessarily be that which corrupts. Now, Socrates says then of the unique good and unique bad, that only the unique bad of that thing can destroy it. That it can't be the case that, let's say, a lack of courage leads one to be immoderate. No. It's only a lack of courage, or it's only rashness or cowardness that leads one to not be courageous, that destroys courage. But cowardice does not lead someone to be immoderate. It's only immoderacy or an excess that leads one to not be moderate. So we have to think then in terms of the being of a thing and what destroys that thing, and then whether or not that thing then has its opposite of which it can be destroyed. So if for each thing there is a unique good and a unique bad, think about bodies. A body can be destroyed. A body necessarily comes into being, it generates, and all things which generate then are subject to degeneration. But a soul, even when it becomes unjust, as was discussed in the devolution from Callipolis all the way to tyranny, when we saw the ultimately unjust soul, the tyrannical soul, even when it becomes unjust, it isn't destroyed. Well, if even with the unique bad of that thing, it doesn't destroy a soul, then that means a soul is immortal. So, souls are immortal. And Socrates says, I heard of this story that told about the immortality of the soul, and why then actually deeds in one's physical life carry on to the afterlife and stay with the immortal soul and affect it, even after one has died. So the myth of is about this story of this man named who is about to be, died, is about to be burned on a pyre, but then happens to awaken after 12 days of being dead. Right before he's about to be burned, he awakens and tells of what he saw while he was dead for those 12 days. It's a very long story, actually, that Socrates gives. I'm not going to read the entire thing, but I'll explain a little bit. And Socrates says that, speaking of for all the unjust deeds they had done, all the people in the afterlife that he's seeing, all the unjust deeds they had done, anyone and all the men to whom they had done injustice, they had paid the penalty for it, everyone in turn, 10 times over for each. That is, they were punished for each injustice once every 100 years, taking this as the length of human life. In this way, they could pay off the penalty for the injustice 10 times over. Now, at one point then, as these people are gathered and they're punished, everybody who, they're going to be reborn, they're given a chance to look at a bunch of different souls to choose from, of what life they will be reborn into. And each of these souls kind of are patterns of the kind of life that they will live. Now, what's interesting is the character that the individual developed in their life affects, of course, how they judge. And someone with a worse soul is going to judge more poorly than someone with a better soul as to what life, what soul they ought to choose for their next life, of who they're going to be reincarnated into. It is only those individuals who have studied virtue through philosophy that will know which lives are best to lead among the choices. We can think about this, again, mirroring Book 1 and 10 with the characters throughout the dialogue. And we can see how the fate of Cephalus, Polemarchus, Glaucon, and so on As Socrates says, speaking in the voice of for the most part, the choice was made according to the habituation of their former life. And we can see, actually, who basically is a representation of Cephalus. That individual who, was greedy, judged at the first one, or grabbed at the first one they saw, and it just so happened, when they saw what it was they grabbed, they were fated to eat their children. Now, we know that historically what happened was, it was Cephalus's unjust life that led so many people to rise up against, when the 30 tyrants took over, led so many of them to come and murder Cephalus's family, including his son Polemarchus, for the deeds of the father, Cephalus. But also what's interesting in the story of the myth of is that describes this individual as, they're so corrupt that when they grab at that soul, they do so rashly. They then realize they're fated to do something terrible, and yet then they try to say how it's still a good thing. They want to justify it anyways. They don't want to learn from the action they just committed right then and there. So there's a supposition here, right, in the whole Republic, that the appearance of being just brings greater rewards than actually being just. And it's in the myth of that this is overturned. Now, why? Why is there a myth required to overturn this appearance? So again, if you remember in Book 2, it was, the individual who lives the unjust life, because they're able to have more wealth, they're able to offer more offerings to the gods, and then the gods are going to love them more than the just individual in the afterlife. But what's being told here in the myth of is, an account of why actually even in the afterlife the unjust individual is fated worse than the just individual. Why can't Socrates give a rational argument for this? Well, in many ways he already has. But the problem is, to explain why something is good in itself, you can't then give reasons outside of the thing itself, right? It's only understood philosophically. Well, if Socrates is trying to persuade individuals why they ought to pursue philosophy, why they ought to pursue a just life, perhaps he has to offer a kind of imitation, a story, to persuade individuals, like with a noble lie, to act for the sake of justice. And hopefully later on they will learn why, justice is a good in itself. If that's the case, then what we're seeing here, and in fact what Socrates says, is that imitation which leads to untruth or injustice is bad. But imitation, even though it's third removed from the truth, isn't bad in itself. So imitation, in its nature, isn't bad. It's how imitation is used, for what ends. In the same way that good-natured individuals aren't even necessarily good in themselves. It depends on the environment they're raised in. And good individuals, with those with good souls by nature, raised in bad environments, turn out to be the most wicked of individuals. So imitation isn't in itself bad. It's how it's used. We can see this in the myth of and even the Republic, as a whole, for that matter. The Republic is an imitation. We have, in the case of the myth of Socrates, who is speaking, imitating the story of that tells. But Socrates is actually imitating Socrates telling this story, because remember, Socrates is recounting an entire conversation that happened a day earlier. So he's imitating that conversation. Then you have Plato, who's imitating the whole dialogue of Socrates, imitating the entire conversation, and then, in this case of Socrates, imitating And then we even have, potentially, the reader, who's imitating in their own mind how they interpret it, imitating what Plato has written. So we have the myth of being a kind of poetic fantasy, a kind of imitation, and the Republic itself being imitation. Think about, the ideal city in speech is an imitation of the idea because it is in words, it's an imitation of the idea of the just city. So imitation is necessary for one's grasping of truth. And again, we saw this in books 6 and 7 as to why beauty and appearances actually enable one to eventually, if appearances are engaged in and are created in the right way, to lead beyond appearances to the thing itself, to what is more real. And so maybe the myth of is a kind of noble lie for the sake of Glaucon and others. But I think it's really interesting to think about the status then of reason being privileged over imitation, or philosophy being privileged over poetry. Because it seems like you can't really engage in philosophy, engage in a pursuit of the truth without poetry either, such that philosophy is implicated by poetry, is implicated by rhetoric. That as much as philosophy wants to focus on logic, on the substance of a claim itself, it can never even think about or through the substance of a claim without thinking about its form, without thinking about the rhetoric that encapsulates the claim, the substance itself. So this is also, in a way, a critique of the limits of philosophy. Finally, how do we interpret Callipolis, right? This idea that what Socrates is talking about in dialogue with the others in the Republic, it is the ideal city. We have the traditional interpretation that Callipolis is utopia. It's what Plato thinks is literally the ideal city, the best possible city. So this interpretation says that everything Socrates says should be taken straightforwardly, in the sense that Callipolis is the ideally just city, that philosophers should rule, that the myth of the metals should be the founding lie of the ideally just city, that Callipolis should actually be pursued, that there should be these three different classes of the producers, the working class, the auxiliaries or the warriors, and then the guardians, the rulers. That is, Callipolis' ideal in that sense. It is utopia. If that's the case, what about all the kinds of inconsistencies and often contradictions that I've mentioned, not just now with imitation, but in other instances in the other books as well? What do we make about that? Another kind of interpretation of Callipolis is that it might be the ideal city, it might not be the ideal city. It doesn't really matter, because what Plato's doing here with Callipolis is showing the limits of philosophy with respect to politics, showing the limits of the relation between theory and practice. That the lesson of the Republic is that utopian thinking is dangerous, and that there's actually no hope for political philosophy ever overcoming the problem of human nature. That this is the interpretation we get from Alan Bloom, who's actually I think the best interpreter of the Greek of Plato's writing in the Republic. But he sees this, when you have the casting out of everyone over the age of 10, when you have the degeneration of Callipolis, when you even have the fact that you have the elimination of private property, everything being held in common, someone like Alan Bloom sees this as kind of tyrannical and something that ultimately fails, which is why Callipolis degenerates. And that's how we should interpret Callipolis, as a kind of warning that philosophers should engage in politics too much. It's not a problem of philosophy, but it's a problem of human nature. Well, if this interpretation is correct, why the focus, though, on pursuing the ideal for the sake of the ideal? Why is there this emphasis on, something being good in and of itself? Why is there this emphasis on the philosopher? They don't just leave the cave, to pursue knowledge of the forms for themselves, but they necessarily come back into the cave and try to raise others out of their dogmatic slumber, to unburden them of the opinions of others, to enlighten them, to enlighten everyone in the cave. Right? That's what Socrates did. That's why he was a gadfly. And secondly, how does this kind of a critique square with all the other positive senses of aporia throughout the Platonic corpus? If in this sense, the Republicans in aporia, because we try to found the ideal city in speech, but then in thinking about it actually being implemented in practice, it doesn't seem like this is possible. So maybe this is a kind of impasse. As for the pursuit of justice, but when you read the Theaetetus and it ends in aporia as to the question of what is knowledge, this isn't because then we should stop pursuing what knowledge is, the question of what knowledge is, the nature of knowledge. When we read the Euthyphro, and it ends in impasse with the question, what is virtue, it's not because then we should stop pursuing the question, what is virtue, and with all the other kinds of dialogues, right? That's not, the point of aporia is not to prevent further inquiry, especially philosophical inquiry. It's to educate, to edify, and encourage further philosophical inquiry, to go beyond the text itself. A third interpretation is what I'm just calling Socratic utopia. And it basically is the view that utopia is not really found in Callipolis. It's only found in the city of necessity, where there is peaceful and simple existence, with people not going beyond their needs. But, so we have basically one author, I'm actually forgetting their name right now, who writes about this. They think that what's described in the city of necessity is kind of a city built in the image of Socrates. And the problem is, human beings aren't like Socrates. They're not fully moderate or perhaps virtuous in that way. And so, in that sense, the city of necessity is a literal utopia in the sense of the term coming from the good place, but also being pronounced in a different way. It sounds like no place. So literally, utopia is both good place and no place. So literally, the city of necessity is no place. So we have to settle not for the best city, but the best possible city. That interpretation says then, well, Callipolis is not the best city, not the ideal city in that sense, but it's only the best possible city. So then, in that sense, though, it's not utopia, only the city of necessity is utopia. And then whether we should still, pursue Callipolis then, that's not entirely clear from this interpretation. But if that's true, that utopia is actually the city of necessity and not Callipolis, then isn't the city of necessity irrelevant? Why would utopia matter? Why would the ideal city matter at all? Or vice versa, maybe Callipolis is irrelevant because it's not the ideal city. And what would we make then of the fact that Callipolis, if it's not utopia, is the center? It's the focus of the Republic and not the city of necessity. Finally, perhaps there's another interpretation. Perhaps there is a critique being made of the problems of human nature. But perhaps that's not meant to discourage further inquiry into what justice might look like and whether it would be possible at all. Perhaps there are some things to learn from Callipolis, maybe because it is called the beautiful city, and as, for example, talked about in the Symposium, beauty is that which leads one beyond the realm of appearance into the thing itself. Maybe Callipolis is kind of an educational city. It's a stepping stone towards the truly just city. So maybe the Republic, isn't just meant to be a kind of warning. Maybe it isn't meant to just found utopia, but say that it's irrelevant. But maybe it's more of a kind of critical theory that's being argued by Socrates or perhaps Plato in the Republic. And perhaps still, there's yet another interpretation of Callipolis.